Welcome, class. Let's begin our conversation or the presentation on Chapter 8, Physiology in Psychophysics. So after you read and discuss this chapter 8, you should be able to understand the role that the 17th and 18th century played in allowing philosophical questions concerning man to be examined in new, more precise ways. Up until this point, what we've seen primarily are philosophers coming up with questions and supposing the answer to those questions about how the universe actually works. But they didn't actually test these things out to try to find some support for them other than using logic and rationale. We also want to be familiar with the early research of brain functioning and familiar with the rise of experimental psychology. Scientific advances. Advances help to address the question, by what mechanisms do empirical events come to be represented in consciousness? Everything from sense perception to motor reactions was studied intensely and gave birth to experimental psychology. Early reaction time study illustrated the importance of individual differences and demonstrated the importance of discrepancy between objective and subjective reality. Evident that there was not a point-to-point correspondence between the physical reality and the psychological experience of that reality. So researchers became very interested in the physiology of the organism. The Bell-Mendingen law demonstrated that sensory nerves enter the dorsal roots of the spinal cord, and motor nerves emerge from the ventral roots. It separated nerve physiology into sensory and motor functions. This was significant because it demonstrated that the specific mental functions are mediated by different anatomical structures. No longer possible to think of nerves as general conveyors of vibrations or spirits. Sensory nerves carried impulses from the sense receptors to the brain, and motor nerves carried impulses from the brain to muscles and glands. This suggested separate sensory and motor regions of the brain. Now enters Johannes Müller and the doctrine of specific nerve energies. Müller demonstrated that each of the 5 types of sensory nerves results in a characteristic sensation. In other words, each nerve responds in its own way regardless of the stimulation which activated it. So each sensory system is maximally sensitive to a specific type of stimulation, but may be stimulated by other forms of energy. So other forms of energy may cause a stimulation to occur in the particular nerve, but certain nerves are designed specifically to be maximally sensitive to specific types of stimulation. For example, the nerves of the eye being sensitive to electromagnetic waves or light waves. So the central nervous system, not the physical stimulus, determines our sensations. Hermann von Helmholtz. Well, Hermann von Helmholtz disagreed with the concept of vitalism which was proposed by Müller. The concept of vitalism which states that life comes from a force beyond physical and chemical processes alone. So what vitalism and Müller were suggesting here was that there is some other special force that is not physical and not chemical that is involved in the process of life. So vitalism says that life comes from a force beyond the physical and chemical. So Helmholtz disagreed with this. Because it was not physical, the life force was not conducive to scientific analysis. Again, we've seen this question a time or two as well. We want things which are conducive to being analyzed. And so a life force, this vitalism, was beyond that. It almost sounds something as if it's faith. So he wanted it to be more on a scientific footing. So the materialist position that Helmholtz and others held stated that life could be explained in terms of physical and chemical processes, and thus there is no need to exclude the study of life or anything else from the realm of science. So through research, he was able to demonstrate the application of the principle of conservation of energy to living organisms, so that everything required for life was there within the body itself with regards to the physical and chemical processes. He also measured the speed of the nerve conduction, finding nerve conduction in humans to be between 165 and 330 feet per second. So we're getting numbers associated with part of the process of a human organism. So this provided further evidence that physical chemical processes are involved in our interactions with the environment rather than some mysterious process that would be more equivalent to something in the medieval times. Further, Hermann von Helmholtz, sensations are raw elements of experience. So the sensations are out there, we pick them up, and they're the raw elements of our experience. And perceptions are sensations after given meaning by the person's past experience. So our past experiences play a role in what it is that we're going to perceive. So he sees sensations as raw elements, and then we add stuff to that sensations, giving it meaning. That is our perception, and that will be influenced by our past experiences. So if we look at the following graphic that I just put up there, we see A, B, C. And then we see 12, 13, 14. You'll notice that the B and the 13 are basically the same image. But based on context alone, will have an impact on our perception of that image. So if we only see A in this image, then C, and there's nothing else, we'll see it as a B. If we only see that image in 12 and 14, we'll see it as a 13. So here, our expectation, past experience of what that could be has an influence on our perceptions. To explain the transformation from sensation to perception, he relied on the ideas of unconscious inference and past experience. He also devised a theory of color vision, which proposed three types of color receptors corresponding to the three primary additive colors. The firing of these receptors in various combinations results in the subjective color experiences corresponding to various wavelengths of light. He proposed also a resonance place theory of auditory perception, in which the pitches of sound we hear are determined to a great extent on where along the basilar membrane the most vibration is occurring in response to a sound vibration. So the mind's task was to create a reasonably accurate conception of reality from the various signs that it receives from the body's sensory systems. So the mind is active here, very much unlike we saw in the early days of empiricism, where it was all passive. Here the mind actively helps to construct the reality based on our perception around us, based on the various sensations that we are able to detect. Then we have Ewald Hering. He suggested that receptors in the eye provide information regarding depth. For Hering, space perception was an innate characteristic of the eye. He also proposed an alternative theory of color vision to Helmholtz. His theory suggested receptors in the eye which respond in an opponent process manner: red and green, blue, yellow, and black and white. So red and green are in opposition, blue, yellow in opposition, and black and white in opposition. So this may be familiar with you or to you. This is an after image slide. Well, you can look at it, you stare at the middle dot for a little bit of time. You can take the moment here to stare at this little bit. And what happens is those particular receptors in your eye, here we see the yellow ones are being excited, for example. The yellow has been excited, and therefore the blue is not working right now. But when we go to the next slide, you'll see an after image of these particular colors. They're opposite colors: red, green, blue, yellow, black, white, and so on. And so if you stare at it long enough, when I go to the next slide, you'll see the impact. Okay, moving on. So also, the current views states that Young-Helmholtz theory is correct at the retina level, but the neuronal process further up the system worked in an opponent process manner, as Herring's theory proposed. So he was right. Christine Ladd Franklin proposed a theory of color vision that was based on evolutionary theory and the evolution of the physiology of the system. Franklin concluded that achromatic vision came first, then blue-yellow sensitivity, and finally red-green sensitivity. When we see things couched or based in evolutionary theory, it tends to suggest that what they're proposing is that there was an evolutionary benefit for some sort of characteristic to be selected for. So when those individuals who developed the blue-yellow sensitivity and those who did not develop the blue-yellow sensitivity, those ones were able to have an advantage and be able to have more offspring compared to those who did not develop that particular sensitivity. So basically, the idea here is that our vision developed based on a need for us to be aided in surviving, and those who had those particular types of characteristics survived, and that's why we have them today. Early research on brain functioning. Toward the end of the 18th century, it was believed that a person's character could be determined by analyzing his or her facial characteristics, physiognomy. So the idea here is that we can look at somebody's face, analyze them, and be able to determine something about their character. To some extent, we probably see some of these types of things still around today. Us judging people's eyes and characters and lack of symmetry in certain ways to figure out, at least at an anecdotal level, what type of person they may be. Of course, it's not going to be really supported by data, but the notion is that's what we saw in the early research as well. Then we have what you're probably very familiar with, phrenology. Franz Gall developed the first cohesive ideas about phrenology. The magnitude of one's faculties in the mind could be determined by examining the bumps and depression on one's skull. And this was something that had taken root early on, and people were doing these analyses at parties. So it was something that was somewhat popular for a time. Johann Sprutheim popularized the practice of phrenology with books and demonstrations of its uses. Several phrenologists claim that particular faculties can become stronger with practice. So one of the ideas that phrenology held was the brain was a muscle and could be exercised in a way to improve. So the idea here that with practice it can become stronger. A formal discipline. A number of educators took this mental muscle approach by suggesting that practicing could make the faculties associated with a particular discipline stronger. And the suggestion there would be maybe it would also then have an impact on one's skull. Pierre Florenz used the ablation method, that is destroying part of the brain and noting behavioral consequences, and investigated localization of function in the brain. So the idea here is that you destroy an area of the brain and then you see how the organism behaves. And if some ability has been influenced or is gone that they previously had before the ablation, then one could assume that that area of the brain that had been destroyed had some sort of role in that particular type of behavior. So when Florenz did his research using the ablation method, he found findings that were contrary to phrenologists. So the phrenologist would say this part of the brain does this, and if he would go in there and ablate it and there was no seemingly different or deficit in that particular behavior, then that would be somewhat of a disproof to the phrenologist's idea. So he observed that in some cases, the function that was lost to an ablation was also regained later. That tends to suggest maybe some idea or possibility of neurogenesis. So let me pause here and just reiterate something that I mentioned previously. Earlier in our course so far, we have seen people, philosophers in particular, come up with powerful questions and ideas as to how they think the answer is to that particular question. But that's all they really did, and use logic or rationale to either support or poke holes in other people's ideas. But now what we're seeing is people investigating, doing research and experimentation of sorts to try to gain support for or support against particular ideas or questions and ideas that have been proposed. This is a major advancement to what we've seen before and what we've been talking about previously. Paul Broca and Carl Wernicke. Using the clinical method, observations in the clinical setting, they were able to localize language and communication functions in the brain. We now know of Broca's area, responsible for speech production. So damage to that particular area would have someone have difficulty speaking. And Wernicke's area, responsible for speech comprehension. And of course, damage to that area would have some issue with someone comprehending speech. Electrophysiology. Frisch and Hitzig. Using electrical stimulation of brain neurons, they found the cortex is not insensitive as previously thought. That when certain area of the cortex is stimulated, muscular movements on the opposite side of the body are elicited, thus discovering the motor cortex. What would turn out later to be the sensory cortex was also discovered. These findings and observations by others, research extended the research that was done earlier of established laws to the brain. Now, the rise of experimental psychology. But now, it was widely believed that conscious sensations were triggered by brain responses initiated by sense reception. So, widely believed at this point that our conscious sensations were triggered by brain responses initiated by our sense reception. Our sense receptors picking up in the environment stimuli that they're designed to detect. But how are conscious mental events and the physiological processes of our sensory system related? That was the question. So now call in Ernst Weber. He investigated the sense of touch and mapped out the sensitivity to touch for the entire body using the 2-point threshold. Sensitivity ranged from the most sensitive on the tongue to the least sensitive on the back. Work in kinestheses led to the determination of the just noticeable difference, that is, the least amount of change necessary to notice a difference along a particular dimension between two stimuli. And with Weber, he determined that Weber's law, the finding that the amount of change necessary to notice a difference, the just noticeable difference, the J and D, is a constant fraction relating to the stimuli. This was the first quantitative law in psychology. So basically, if you have two light sources, what they're able to calculate is to be able to calculate what percentage difference between those two stimuli there needs to be before you can notice that there's two different light sources there of different intensities. Gustav Fechner. He was interested in the relationship between the body and the mind. It led him directly to the study of psychophysics. He speculated that for mental sensations to change arithmetically, the physical stimulus must change geometrically. Research and further mathematical workings with Weber's law resulted in Fechner's formula describing the relationship between the mental and the physical. So So other research included studies on the absolute threshold, which is the lowest intensity at which a stimulus can be detected, the difference threshold, which is the amount a stimulus magnitude that needs to be changed before a person detects the difference, as I just mentioned earlier. And he developed various methods of research, including the methods of limit, the method of constant stimuli, and the method of adjustment.